Mr. Techman, are we live? Are we live? Okay. What is your name again? Charlie, thank you, Charlie. Thank you for attending this meeting of the Elections Committee, February the 15th, 2022, House Elections Committee, and we will begin our meeting with 4 hearings, and hopefully we'll get through them all. If we don't, we have Thursday to cram them into, but we will work whatever it takes to get a reasonable stop for this day. And today we'll start with as previously posted, House Bill 2576. And to review, we ask Assistant Advisor Mike Heim to present a brief review.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill was requested by the Governmental Ethics Commission, and Mark Skoglin will give you, Skoglin, I apologize for butchering your name, Mark. Anyway, it is just basically a cleanup bill, and it's got 5 sections. Section 1 deletes some language. It refers to a statute that's been repealed for a while, so Section 1 is strictly cleanup. Section 2 provides extending the time for a hearing once the Ethics Commission finds probable cause from 30 days to 90 days. So they have 90 days to provide for a hearing. Section 3 deals with maintaining their records and complaints and so on. And they add some language about federal officer or employee that would be new, which would be designated to assist the commission in their work. Section 4 provides that each lobbyist shall register electronically. That's on lines 36 on page 2. Page 4, section 5. There's a couple of, and on page 4 and 5, there's a where the commission sends a notice by registered or certified mail to any person failing to register or to file a report, and where they fail to file an amended report, the time frame for deciding whether there'll be a civil penalty is once the notice is deposited in the mail, not the receipt of the notice as current law provides. If you got questions, I'll try and answer them. Mark here is a better person to ask.
Very specific questions for Mike. If not, we'll move on to proponents. Any questions for Mike? He's deferred to the proponent, and that is Mr. Mark Skoglin, Executive Director of Government Ethics Commission. And thank you, Mark, for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Mike, don't worry about it. No one gets my name right on the first, second, or third try. I'm very, very used to it. So today, you get to hear from me a lot, and I appreciate the opportunity to have our ethics recommendations in front of the House Elections Committee today. So thank you for the opportunity. 2576 and 2577, which is the next hearing, are really 2 sides of the same coin. They're both cleanup items. This is about the sections relating to the ethics and lobbying laws, and 2577 that we'll hear in a minute is for the Campaign Finance Act. You'll see there's a lot of overlap when we get to the next hearing, but just for a quick overview, I do think some of the items are fairly self-descriptive and self-explanatory. But I do want to briefly mention a couple of things. The second section regarding the time period for hearings. The commission currently meets on every 4th Wednesday, and the current statute indicates that we must, once we find probable cause, must set a hearing within 30 days. Well, the way the calendar works, the fourth Wednesday is not always within 30 days of the prior fourth Wednesday. So it's not practical to comply with that particular statute. Again, just like anything else in this bill or the other cleanup bill that we'll talk about momentarily, this doesn't change the day-to-day, but it's important to the commission to have our statutes reflect actual commission practice. So we view that as a cleanup item. The federal official expertise item, the third section, is really about instances where right now the commission can always request assistance from a state employee on an investigation. So for example, I believe the testimony talks about a scenario where we may need some better understanding of how bank regulation works. Frankly, we don't have anyone in the commission who's an expert on bank regulation. And so as a result, we may need to request assistance from, say, the Office of the State Bank Commissioner. Now, when the statute was written in 1981, it's probable that there was an oversight, that there are instances where, frankly, federal officials are the proper entity to be asking for some assistance from. Whether it's the IRS or the FEC more commonly, they frankly deal with some instances that we don't see in Kansas very often. It would be helpful for us to be able to easily be able to solicit expertise from them when necessary. I do want to clarify, this doesn't expand the federal government's ability to look at our investigations. They're still confidential by statute. This only allows us to reach out to federal officials for expertise when we deem it necessary. Sections 4 and 5 on the back of my testimony. Right now, since 2018, all lobbyists have had to file expenditure reports electronically, but the statute for registering actually was not updated at the same time. So technically, right now, it's possible for a lobbyist to file their registration on paper, somehow get a login identification from the Secretary of State's office, and then file all of their expenditure reports electronically. It's a conflict in the laws that probably wasn't intended, and so this would update that so that not only do they have to file their reports electronically, but they have to register electronically as well. That last item, those of you who've been on the committee for a while recall that in 2018, due to a lot of work by this very committee, actually, civil penalties for both candidates from the primary and general election and lobbyists had a grace period that was significantly shortened, and civil penalties were increased rather dramatically. Now, what the end result of that is a significant increase in compliance. Right now, for example, lobbyists, about just over 99% of lobbyists typically file their reports without needing to receive a failure to file from us, which is truly an incredible number. And this is due in part, of course, to my excellent staff. Jessica White is our lobbyist coordinator, but also, frankly, the lobbying community tries to be very cooperative. I do think that the civil penalty updates did provide a lot of motivation to assist in gaining that compliance as well. Now, in 2018, when that law was changed, the intention was that the notice provision, when the grace period was shortened, the intention was, and it seems that that's reflected in part in statute, that the grace period of 2 days begins when it's placed in the mail, because lobbyists know when the deadlines are. They're the same every year. And this is the same that happens in campaign finance. Prior to 2018, we could not start civil penalties for lobbyists until we could confirm we received certified mail back proving that they have received the notice. Now, in reality, that may have been something that worked in, say, 2010, but now when you send certified mail off, it can take 3 months before you ever get that receipt back. So in reality, if we were required to rely on receipt of notice, then we would never be able to assess a civil penalty for any lobbyists. If there are any lobbyists in the crowd behind me, I'm sure that they're paying a little bit of attention here. Now, I think that what's important here, though, is that since 2018, the conflict we've been resolving in the direction of what we believe the intention of the legislature was. This just cleans this up so the practice of the commission continues to be in that same direction. I can certainly take any questions at the appropriate time.
Is there any questions for Mr. Skoglin? Officer, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That phrase that deposited in the mail, is that what you say here? I've kind of lost it here, but does that mean, how do you know when something is deposited in the mail? Is that the postmark or is that the date on the letterhead or what?
So typically, the postmark and the date on the letter are the same for our office. We will place the item in the mail typically 2 days after the deadline. So for example, the lobbying deadline is January 10th. On January 12th, we will place failure to files in the mail. Once we've placed it in the mail, there's another 2-day grace period that applies, which means that there's a short grace period where lobbyists can still file even late and not receive any civil penalty. In this time, we also actually will frequently send out emails both before and after the deadline, reminding people of the deadline that they have to file. And again, these deadlines for lobbyists are the same 6 deadlines every single year. They don't change. And so starting the civil penalty from the time it's deposited in the mail would be consistent with how it's handled in every other venue for our office.
So you think that deposited in the mail means both the postmark date and the date on the letter?
It means that it is the date that we physically have placed the item in the flow of mail. So it's the date that we have handed it to the Postal Service, whatever that ends up meaning for their office. We obviously don't control when the post office places a postmark on it or anything like that. But when we place an item in the mail, what it means is that we've literally done exactly that. We've given the item to a post officer.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Representative Daber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I ask a question on, we know that the mail doesn't get delivered in 2 days unless it's your next door neighbor and you walk it over there. So pretty much. What if you used, since you use email or electronic communication, would it be better because you can mark your email that when it's opened, then that you know that person has read it? Would that be a better way to do that? Because we cannot depend on the mail. Second of all, there are times when there are letters that come to legislators and things that are, I want to say, maybe the check was written in September and they sent it out in October. So you can't depend on that date on the letter necessarily. And it's multiple groups that do that, not just that group. I was just using them as an example. So is there a way to maybe reshape that into electronic notification rather than mail with note that you can read it, you'll know when they read it?
Sure. So a few things that I think are important here. Number one is that we do actually send emails. Email is the primary method of communication we use for our lobbying community, and it has been extremely effective. Most lobbyists do typically respond to emails and are aware of emails, frankly, more than they're typically aware of the mail. Now, the current statute, and I think that this is probably intended, does not allow for us to serve certain items like failure to files through email for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of legal reasons why service through email is a little bit more difficult than actual mail service. There's very clear mail statutes providing mail service. However, when we essentially provide service to the mail, we've already sent that email as well. So typically what we see here is the way that we are currently enforcing it and the way that this cleanup bill would resolve it, this actually gives lobbyists a little bit more time than they would if we relied upon email as proof of service. The second thing that was part of your question as well is that mail is sometimes obviously something that is late. Now, this is why we often will not only email, but if we've gotten past the deadline a little bit, our lobbying coordinator, Jessica White, will frequently make calls to lobbyists as well. We do really anything we can to try to avoid civil penalties. In a perfect world, we would assess 0 civil penalties. Unfortunately, obviously, that's not the case. The last thing that I will note too, that there are instances when frankly usually this is when someone leaves, for example, a lobbying firm and they go work somewhere else. So emails aren't getting to them, mail isn't getting to them for whatever reason. They can always, and there's no limitation on what this might mean, anytime someone receives a civil penalty, they can always request a waiver for good cause. And this has meant a variety of different things over the years. Sometimes it is just the fact that they left a previous firm and had no ability to receive our communications, we typically grant those waivers. In fact, our annual report lists the amount of waivers we provide in civil penalties, and it's a pretty substantial amount. But it's for a variety of different items. That allowance of a good cause waiver, I think, helps resolve some of those tensions as well.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you. Representative Proctor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For this change in section 1 of the timeline, or basically the removal of a timeline, I'm a little concerned about just making it open-ended. Is there a number of days that would work for you on that, that would fix the problem without just making it open-ended?
I apologize if I could ask a clarification. Are you talking about section 2 about the 30-day requirement to set a hearing?
Well, I'm looking at it in section 1. You've removed no complaint alleging a violation of KSA, so and so such and forth may be filed with the commission after expiration of 30 days.
Correct. So that particular section only applied to one particular kind of violation, and that violation no longer exists. That underlying statute was repealed.
Okay, so it's the next one, which, okay, I see. I apologize. I misunderstood what you were saying. Thank you.
It's the way these statutes work. They're having that underlying statute being repealed made this a little bit difficult. We had to have long conversations in our office before we realized what had happened there.
Okay.
ourselves.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, kind sir. And I will move now to potential, is there any other proponents? Are there any neutrals present or online? And are there any opponents, either online or in the audience? All right. Then I will close the hearing on HB 2576 and move to open the hearing on HB 2577. And Mike, would you please give a brief overview?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is another governmental ethics bill, deals with campaign finance, different statutes. Section 1 literally deletes 2 words in both, which dealt with where you file these things, and they are no longer filed in 2 different places. There was some language that's been amended, and anyway, that literally is just a cleanup. Section 2 deals with advertising, political advertising, and so on. And on page 4, corrupt political advertising is defined, and the section that's amended deals with emails, websites, and other internet communications. Currently, it requires that there be an attribution sponsored by or whatever following the advertisement, and this would provide instead that there is a clear and conspicuous statement paid for or sponsored by, followed by the name of the chairperson or treasurer of the political or other organization, and so on. So the idea is that some of these communications go on and on and on, and you can never figure out where the end is. So this would say it's got to be conspicuous who is sponsoring it. Section 3 deals with complaints, and it's the 30-day to 90-day provision in terms of hearings. Section 4 deals with, again, their records and so on, and includes federal officer and employee that they can request for assistance from in their investigation. Section 5 is a cleanup. It changes from the $500 provision in terms of expenses where you're not have to file campaign finance reports. There was a change in the law in 254173 They changed it to 1,000, but this statute was missed. It should have been 1,000, and that's literally a cleanup, so.
Thank you, Mr. Heim. And we have one proponent, and he happens to be close to the microphone. That would be Mark Skoglin of Governmental Ethics. Thank you, sir.
Thank you again. Again, this is a cleanup bill. This is for the Campaign Finance Act portions of our cleanup recommendations. There's, other than the items that are very self-explanatory or repeats from 2576, that social media paid for attribution is actually, it makes it easier for candidates, PACs, and parties to comply with paid for attribution requirements on electronic communication. Oftentimes, we're talking here about social media. Right now, technically, the paid for requirement is that it appears at the end of the item, but on certain social media pages like Facebook, there is no end of the item. It scrolls back in reverse chronological order forever. And so this essentially memorializes how we've been enforcing it, which just says it must appear somewhere on the page in some way that is clear to a viewer. This would mean that the statute actually is something that is possible to comply with on social media. Additionally, it's always dangerous using this language, but I do think it's somewhat future-proofed. So future kinds of electronic communication are also resolved pretty easily here, because all this requires is that the paid for appears and it's clear and conspicuous. That can mean different things on different websites. The last is that statutory conflict, the 5th section on the back, about the affidavit. When the amount for the affidavit was increased from $500 to $1,000, the companion statute that indicates what to do if you exceed the affidavit had that amount still left at $500. So that just needs to be increased to $1,000 as well to conform with that prior change that was made to the affidavit statute. I can certainly take any questions at the appropriate time.
Committee, any questions? Anyone online? Or is there anyone online in the committee? All right. Thank you, Mr. Skoglin. We've now closed the hearing on 2577. Now it's on recorded. And we will move to HB 2579. And for review, we'll ask Mike Heim to go to the microphone. Thank you.
Chairman, members of the committee, again, this is a Ethics Commission bill. It provides that reports filed by treasurers for candidates of state offices shall be filed electronically. So current law provides a statewide, and this would extend it to state, which means you folks as well. And any candidate for state office can request an exemption from the electronic filing, and the Governmental Ethics Commission Executive Director may grant an exemption for cause. So that's the bill.
All right, thank you, sir. We have two proponents listed. First, we'll hear from Mr. Skoglin.
Funny seeing you all again. Thank you again for the opportunity. This is our primary legislative recommendation. As you've heard, I know this committee has voted it out favorably every year for the past few years. I'm optimistic that this is the year that we can gain further progress as well. So right now 43 states, which is an increase from last year, 43 states now require electronic filing for all state level candidates. Kansas is one of the 7 remaining states that do not require electronic filing. Now, obviously, there's a number of benefits, and we've talked about some of them. The first biggest one is the one we'd like to talk about the most because it benefits candidates, and that's that many errors that happen on paper filing or other methods of filing reports simply are impossible to do on an electronic filing system. The electronic, for example, you can't make an addition error, which means that it's fewer times that you have to go to your mailbox and see a letter from the Governmental Ethics Commission, which, let's be honest, no one really likes to see. So anytime that we can reduce the number of errors that people make, improves the opportunities for people to be able to comply with the law on the first attempt, which means we avoid issues further down the line. It makes everyone's life just a little bit easier. Also, there's a substantial transparency benefit. Right now, we simply cannot realistically provide, other than the actual copies of the reports, we can't provide any data or any sort of data display to the public in any meaningful way after the election or after campaign finance reports are due. I use Oklahoma as my usual example here. A day or two after a campaign finance report is due, they're able to provide aggregate and specific data for candidates. And that's because it's already automatically entered into a database, all because of their electronic filing system and their requirement that everyone file electronically. The last is something that's very important to us, and that's our office efficiency. Right now, because electronic filing is not required, we have to hand enter every single line of every single report into a database, which takes, on an election year, 3 months of staff time. It is a dramatic and significant impact on our ability to get to the point where we are reviewing those reports in a way that's a little bit faster. Ideally, you don't want to receive an error and omission notice in June for a report that you turned in several months ago. We want to reduce that timeline. We want to make it a lot easier for us to be able to move towards the review stage and ensure that we can be more responsive to candidates. I will say this bill has a couple of things in it. That one of them is actually a creation of this committee a few years ago, and that's the good cause waiver, essentially allowing anyone, for typically someone who does not have reliable access to internet, the ability to ask for a waiver from the electronic filing requirement. But it's written in a way to allow for many other different things that you could call good cause as well. For example, someone might have eye strain and simply cannot, because of a medical condition, sit down in front of a computer for that long to fill out the report. Entirely understandable. There's a number of things that might be different depending on the different candidates. The Commission doesn't oppose a delayed implementation provision if it's necessary. So if the committee deems it necessary to delay implementation, then the Ethics Commission does not oppose some sort of provision saying that this will come into effect in, say, January 2023, for example. The last item I would note is that we're happy to work with the Secretary of State's office and any other stakeholders. We think that the one amendment that might be worth having in this that we haven't considered in previous years is that right now the bill says electronic filing. We would prefer that it say something more along the lines of in a form prescribed by the Secretary of State, because technically you could call an email electronic filing, and that obviously does not resolve the underlying problems we handle, that we deal with. I can certainly take any questions at the appropriate time, but I know there's other people, another proponent as well.
Okay, we'll hear from the other proponent first, and that is Clay Barker, Deputy Assistant and General Counsel to the Secretary of State. Thank you, sir, for your attendance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are also a proponent of the, I guess I'll use the word electronic filing for campaign finance. Quick history, then I'll go into how we do it, and then some suggestions we have to make this an easier transition. First of all, 1909 was the first time the state required candidates to file campaign finance reports, but they were filed at county level. 1959, the state changed that to the Secretary of State, who at that time was actually housed in this building. We were the filing cabinet for the state. 1974, right after Watergate, the state, I guess, sensed the winds and created the Kansas Ethics Commission to analyze the reports, but the reports were still filed with the Secretary of State. That law was updated in 1981. Then in 2007, the state allowed candidates to file electronically. That began in 2008. That seemed to work well. And in 2009, the state required statewide candidates, governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, that they had to file electronically. And if you've ever seen one of their campaign finance reports, it's very large. It's got endless $100 contributions in it. The Secretary of State's office has done the software for the e-filing. And again, we are the intake for these in-house. It's our software. We didn't buy it commercially. That was too expensive. After the first round of filings, we made some updates to it in 2011, and it's pretty much stayed the same software since then. And currently today, there are 19 separate statutes that require a campaign finance filing to be done with our office. Record retention statutes require it to be maintained electronically. And about 73% of Senate filings and 69% of House filings are done electronically today. The 3 ways that a candidate can file with our office, first is by paper or a tangible copy. They can email a PDF, walk it in to us, or mail it to us. The most common problems with those are, one, they're illegible. We can't read the handwriting. Not that our office analyzes it, that's ethics' issue. Or sometimes the font is so small you can barely make out the numbers. People are they're not trying to do anything funny, but they're trying to get everything on one page. And sometimes candidates will actually put their social security number or bank account numbers on it, so our staff will have to review each one and redact that, because that can't be shown publicly. As soon as that's scanned in, it comes up on our website and goes right to ethics for their processing. Second way these reports come in is a candidate's treasurer can key it into our e-filing system, and that's something they can keep updating and updating, and when they're done, they hit final, and then it pops up immediately, can be seen on the website, and goes to ethics. And the third way is a candidate can either use commercial software or an Excel spreadsheet and just upload that onto the system. And usually the only problem there is sometimes the Excel spreadsheet, the columns aren't formatted correctly, so it doesn't upload, and someone will have to call and we'll say, we'll move column G to column I, and it should work fine, then it does. I won't go back over the benefits of this. It would save our staff hours of time. It would save ethics, I think, hundreds of hours of time. What we're happy to do is work with campaign treasurers about issues with the software. We can make small changes now. Larger rewrites of the software would probably have to wait maybe a year, because we do this internally, and our software people are all busy with corporate filings and the new notary system. But we do want to rewrite this software. It's functional, but if you look at it, it just looks a little old. And I've already mentioned this, and a bunch of lobbyists already have grabbed me and said they want to be on this working group to give input into the electronic filing for lobbyists, so they have ideas too. So we can take those and work with people. We're also happy to train anyone, answer questions for anyone. I think the most common reason candidates don't electronically file already is there's no need to. They haven't learned the new system. It's not so much an opposition to the electronic filing itself. And Mr. Chair, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Barker at this time? Okay. Mike.
Are you suggesting any kind of an amendment to the bill, or are you okay with the bill as it is?
Mr. Heim, we're completely fine with the bill as is. I was just saying we're happy to work with a working group for ideas to improve the software. We're happy to do any informal training of candidates or treasurers that need it. We're very flexible on this.
Just as far as implementation.
Right.
Yeah. Any questions for Mr. Skoglin? Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You made a comment that you can't make a mistake on addition and subtraction because it does that. If you go to page 1, it requires you to add your cash to your intake and then subtract. If you hit the wrong number on your calculator, it doesn't correct it. So that I would just stand to correct that. You can screw it up. Thank you.
I apologize, we didn't mean to cut you off. We have seen some very interesting ways for people to make some mistakes both on paper and electronic records. And it is always interesting that people seem to come up with new and different ways to make errors all the time. But that's why we like working with candidates, to try to help them resolve those errors when they come up. And it's been our experience that people who use the e-filing system do encounter substantially fewer errors. Simply put, there's just fewer errors that they are able to make.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Thank you to the conferees, and now we have opportunity for any neutral or opponent, and we don't have any listed. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to testify either neutral or opponent? Not seeing any. At this time, we will close the hearing on HB 2579. We have one more bill to consider this afternoon. It's one has more conferees, and because of that, we may, as the discussion goes, we'll probably limit conferees to 3 minutes. If you need more time, just try to taper it off as quick as you can. The ones presenting the bill, give them a little bit more time just to get the bill described. So we will open this hearing with a review from Revisor Mike Heim. Thank you, sir.
Chairman, members of the committee, this bill deals with advanced voting ballots. An identical bill, I believe, was heard today in the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee. What this bill would do is the deadline for receipt by mail of advanced voting ballots currently is the third day, last delivery of the mail by the U.S. Postal Service on the third day following the date of the election. And what this bill would do is change that to 7 p.m. on Election Day. And that's the bill.
All right. Thank you, sir. First proponent is the one presenting the bill to the committee, and that is Representative Charlotte Esau. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Burgess, Vice Chair Bajoran, Ranking Member Miller, and members of the committee, thank you for hearing this bill and the opportunity to testify in support of it. As the author of the bill, it might be helpful to know the reason behind it. And I've had many constituents come to me with concerns that late arriving ballots changed the outcome of Election Day results in 2021, and this mirrors what I heard in 2020, although they were much more concerned here even in 2021 because it changed the outcome of some local races, and they were a little surprised at how the changes went. So my intention with this bill is simply to increase the voters' faith and trust in our election system. There seems to be a perception that I'd like to address about a firm deadline of 7 p.m. being a challenge for some voters to meet, but you can request an advance ballot months in advance of the election, and if you do that, you get it mailed 3 weeks prior to the election day. Even with slow delivery, that should be plenty of time for folks to get it and turn around and get it back in the mail in a quick enough fashion to get it returned. You can return them personally to your election office or to your county clerk, whoever is running the election in your county. You can drop them in those secure 24/7 drop boxes that we've all heard about. So there's many ways that you can return it. You can also do it on election day at your polling place or in advance at an advanced polling place. So we do offer many options for how to return your ballots by the deadline. And the need for ballots to trickle in for several days after because of those many options simply isn't there like what we were looking at 5 years ago when this was passed. So it's challenging enough to explain to voters about provisional ballots. We all understand them, but for many people, that's a confusing thing. Why do we wait and count certain ones later? And it changes the outcome and why. But my concern with this one was that they see these ballots arriving afterwards. They're not sure they were actually submitted before the close of the polls. And the only way to address that I can see is to say 7 p.m. is the deadline. So thank you, and I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
We'll hear the proponents, and then we'll have a time for questions. Next, we have Keith Esau, former state rep and former elections chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Burgess. As many of you know, I was the election chair in 2017 when the House Bill 2158 was passed, and that's the bill that allowed for accepting ballots after the election as long as they were postmarked by election date. And we thought at the time that we would get ballots that were clearly marked, that they had the proper postmark, and that it would be obvious which ballots could be counted or not. Well, we found out afterwards that the post office is not even postmarking a lot of the letters anymore, and so it's very hard to tell whether a ballot was mailed on time or not. And people have also become aware of the delays that the post office are creating, and so they take account of this at Christmas, they take account of this for birthday cards, they can take account of it for elections. As the previous speaker said, you know, they get their advance ballots weeks ahead of time. They go out 3 weeks ahead of time. Even if it takes a week to get there, they still have 2 weeks to return. And so it's easy to process the ballot at home, mail it back, or drop it off at one of the advanced voting sites, or on the day of election, you can go to any polling place in your county to drop it off. We also now have the secure drop boxes that have been put in, I believe, in every county now. So there are multiple ways to get the ballot returned safely, securely, and on time before the end of the election, and prevent people from thinking, where did these extra ballots come from? Why weren't they received on election day? It closes up the possibility of somebody stuffing ballots after they have a good idea of the results on election day, and people are afraid of that, even if it's an unfounded fear. And this would just increase the security we have in the elections, and I think it's a good idea to revert it back to what we had 5 years ago and have the election day be the election day, and have that be the end of receiving new ballots. And I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll move on to our two Webex conferees for the proponents. And the first one we will recognize is Stuart Wilson, Visiting Fellow Opportunity Solutions Project. And are you online with us?
I am, Chairman.
All right. If you would proceed, and we'll move on after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Burgess and members of the committee. My name is Stuart Whitson, and I'm a visiting fellow at Opportunity Solutions Project. OSP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to advancing policies that reduce barriers to work and promote free and fair elections by making it easy to vote but hard to cheat. I'm submitting this testimony in support of House Bill 2585. The purpose behind House Bill 2585 is simple. Election Day should be Election Day. But under current law, Election Day is not Election Day. It's 3 days after Election Day. That's because the deadline for mail-in ballots to be received by the county election office is not Election Day. It's 3 days after. This is problematic for several reasons. First, allowing ballots to be received days after the election can delay election results. Delay sows doubt. In 2020, we witnessed the problems and controversy caused when election results are delayed, with states across the country, including Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, experiencing such delays. Allowing absentee ballots not received until 3 days after the election invites this delay and doubt into Kansas elections. And that's not good for Kansas or its voters. The simple change HB 2585 would make would help alleviate this problem. Second, ballots that don't arrive until 3 days after an election can seriously undermine voter confidence in the outcome of elections, especially in cases where a close race suddenly flips after Election Day based on a wave of absentee ballots counted after Election Day. We saw this play out in 2020 in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where vote totals early in the night on Election Day put Donald Trump in a commanding lead, only to have Joe Biden eventually win in all 3 states days later after all the mail-in ballots were counted. Now, it's not hard for a reasonable person to understand why some voters might question the veracity of the outcome when a sudden surge of votes for the underdog comes in at the 11th hour. The fact that those votes come from an area that was expected to favor the other candidate does not assuage the concern. it only makes it worse. Whether or not there is fraud, and whether the fraud is widespread enough to change the outcome of the election, is irrelevant when there's something the state can do to significantly improve the situation. And this bill is that something that you can do. Requiring all mail-in ballots to be in the hands of the ballot counters no later than Election Day would surely help to alleviate the concerns of many voters. Not all concerns, but certainly many of them. Election integrity is not only about stopping fraud. It's also about promoting voter confidence in electoral outcomes. HB 2585 would enable the legislature to do just that. And third, creating a deadline other than Election Day can cause serious confusion to voters, leading people to narrowly miss their opportunity to have their vote count because they simply misunderstand the deadline. This in turn can not only erode voter trust in the outcome of elections, but it can also change the actual results, especially in close races decided by only a handful of votes. In 2020,
About 30
voters
seconds. About 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So in 2020, Kansas voters saw this firsthand. 1,500 voters didn't have their votes counted in the August primary because their vote either arrived too late or wasn't postmarked in time. And so all these voters missed the opportunity to have their vote count. By making Election Day the deadline for mail-in ballots to be received by election officials, all these challenges could be addressed. In the end, Election Day should be Election Day. For all these reasons, I urge you to support House Bill 2585. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the proper time.
Thank you, sir. And we will move on with one more online. And that is Missy Levitt, Kansas citizen. Are you there? Is Missy Levitt online with us on Webex?
Yes. Sorry,
Thank you.
can you hear me all right, Mr. Chairman?
We can hear you fine. If you could hold your comments to 3 minutes, and if you kind of be watching, I may just signal you when it's 30 seconds, okay?
Sure, thank you so much.
All right.
I would just like to stand as a proponent for this bill and echo everything Mr. and Mrs. Esau said, as well as Stuart Whitson. They all have very, very valid points, and I come to you all as a citizen of Kansas and a concerned citizen for election integrity as well. There's a lot of doubt. And I would also like to add the point of the county clerks in this matter. When I speak to my county clerk specifically, she's got a lot on her plate already. An extra 3 days of collecting ballots can lead to additional issues and burden for them. And so I'd like to stand for them as well. I don't know how it works in bigger precincts, but I can imagine they need quite a few volunteers to help them, depending on how many mail-in ballots they receive after Election Day. But ultimately, I just think that we can allow for more time beforehand, but it's just like testifying here for you guys. There's a deadline to submit the testimony. That is what it is, and we should stand by it, and it creates less confusion. And so for that matter, I'd like to stand as a proponent and ask everyone to please pass this bill.
All right, ma'am, thank you. And that was less than 3 minutes, but if you, and we'll let you all stand for questions. Any questions from committee for any of the four proponents that have testified? Representative Miller.
For Chairman Esau, one, while you're walking up there, you don't know how much I miss you. Not saying that I do.
Likewise.
I do miss you. So you talked about postmarks. You didn't come out and say it, but sort of inferred by your testimony that there are ballots coming in that are being counted after Election Day that don't have a postmark. Is that happening?
I would have to ask every county clerk. I don't know.
You're not aware of that happening?
I'm not aware of it happening. I'm not aware of them, of everybody excluding it.
But the law is clear that they're only to be counted if they bear a postmark.
I thought so, yeah,
so if-
or an appropriate mark and that we thought we could read, and those marks are not readable, we found out.
But the law is clear that those, not that they come in late, but that they come in after Election Day and they are postmarked by 7 PM on Election Day. And if they're doing anything else, they're violating the law, correct?
Correct.
For Mr. Whitson, you said something in your opening remarks about protecting against cheating.
Yes.
Is there a way for a person to cheat that this bill corrects?
No, so that wasn't that's one of the missions of our organization. That's when that's what I
Right, but
mentioned. cheating.
your support of this bill has nothing to do with eliminating cheating.
No, this is about those 3 reasons that I cited, which were inspiring confidence in the election outcome and avoiding unnecessary delays in the outcome and making
Okay.
sure that everyone's vote counts so that
Okay.
people don't get confused by a
Okay.
confusing rule.
On point number 2, how will this speed up the final results? Given that every canvass in every county in Kansas is held after the 3 days after the election. That's when the election is finalized, and that's when all those provisional ballots are counted. How will this speed up the final results by eliminating this aspect?
Because there will be less absentee ballots to process. And so the one key thing we don't know is how many will they have to process. What we have seen, though, is increasing numbers every year that it's been an option. And so doing this, putting this bill forward, no matter what, you're going to have less ballots that have to be processed. And so that is going to take less time out of the hands of the election officials that are having to do that.
And you mentioned the magnitude of counting write-ins in some of these other, not write-ins, excuse me, mail-ins in some of these other states. And are you aware that unlike some of those other states that added so many mail-in ballots after Election Day, in Kansas, we count mail-in ballots that have arrived to the election office the evening of the election, whereas some of those states couldn't begin to even open them until after Election Day, and consequently, they had tens of thousands of ballots to count later.
I'm aware of that, and that's actually one of the reforms that we strongly promote is to actually start not counting the ballots, but just start processing them early. And so we actually encourage 7 days early, but I'm aware of that.
And how many, you mentioned there were 1,500 ballots that arrived after the Friday after the election, and they weren't counted?
Yes, sir, I cited that according to a Kansas-based election proponent, that there were 1,500.
That didn't count because they came in too late?
Yes, sir.
And do you know how many ballots came in late that weren't counted before this law was changed?
Well, I've heard large numbers of, are you saying during the 3-day period or?
No, I'm saying the number that before this law was changed in 2017. Are you aware of how many ballots arrived late then and were not counted?
No, I'm not.
Well, I can tell you it was multiple times the number of 1,500. There were many, many more people whose vote didn't count until we changed this law. By the way, I take it you're not from Kansas?
I'm not, sir.
Where are you from?
I currently live in Virginia.
Which understandably would explain some of your lack of understanding of Kansas law, correct?
Because I live in Virginia?
Right, you've already admitted to 2 or 3 of my questions that you didn't understand the way things were in Kansas. And now I understand more about that because you're actually from Virginia. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Just, this Chairman Burgess, I just have a follow-up with that. You mentioned earlier that this would cause there to be fewer absentee ballots to be counted. Did you mean in the time frame after the polls close, or fewer ballots, period? Because you mentioned it twice, fewer absentee ballots to be counted. What time frame are you talking about those being counted?
I meant during the time frame after the ballots had closed, Mr.
All right.
Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
And one last thing for Mr. Whitson, and because I understand you're from Virginia, we don't have absentee ballots in Kansas anymore. We have advance ballots. There's no term on the books absentee. You're not the first one that I've pointed that out to. We did have them, and it's over time. It takes a little getting used to using the right vernacular. Thank you for your testimony today.
You're welcome, sir.
Representative Proctor, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I very much appreciate being recognized. I'd like to ask Mr. Whitson a question. Could you say one more time how many ballots you believe came in after the 3-day deadline for them to be, that didn't get counted because they came in after the deadline?
Yes, so the quote from my testimony was, in 2020, voters in Kansas saw firsthand when more than 1,500 voters did not have their votes counted in the August primary because their ballot either arrived too late or wasn't postmarked by Election Day. Does that answer your question?
It very much does, and I'd like to take issue with something that the previous representative cited as a fact. He said that before the law was changed, that many times more ballots were not counted because they didn't come in past the deadline. I'm reading a follow-up answer from Ms. Katie Capal, who used to work for the Secretary of State's office. When we asked her the same question last year, she said that in 2016, exactly 1,449 ballots were not counted. So basically the same amount were not counted when the law was that the ballots had to arrive on Election Day. So it appears that people are smart enough to follow the law, whatever the law is. And if hypothetically we decided as a committee to move this out and the House and the Senate decided to pass it as a law, it appears that it would not disenfranchise anybody more than we theoretically are disenfranchising now because the mail is late. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our conferees for your testimony today. This question is actually for Missy. Is she still on? Maybe?
Yes.
Perfect. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being involved. I love it when citizens are involved, just regular folks, with hearings, and so it's really good to have you on. And I've actually heard you testify before on the Senate side in Fed and State, and I was very impressed with your testimony. So my question to you today is, do you believe, Missy, that there were irregularities in 2020, and how do you believe this law, if it were to be changed, would actually help with those irregularities?
What I can tell you about the United States Postal Service is we have documentation during the mailing of ballots. Like, for instance, a pallet of ballots that was meant for Olathe went to Wichita. And so in order to get those back to where they needed to be, the USPS sent that pallet to not the Kansas City processing center, to a different processing center. And so I'm not really for sure how that works out as far as postmarking, but that we've seen plenty of documentation in our research that proves that, you know, the USPS will actually do what they can to expedite things. I just don't know and can verify whether those postmarks are going to follow the ballots all the way through. So that's a reference for cause of concern. And as far as, you know, any other issues regarding that, I really can't say much other than what my clerks have expressed to me, is that they struggle to get volunteers. And so when you have election day, you know, that's a big deal. And when you have an election that's as polarizing as what 2020 was, the ballot intake is much larger, and I'm sure we'll see more of that in the future. But Then later in the week, you have to come back and find more volunteers to process then the ballots that have not been done. And so that can be really difficult and challenging for the clerks. And it just seems to me that once the polls close and your volunteers have even made the time to do that, let's just end it there. You know, we can go ahead and work with the time prior to help accommodate people, but I just think that everyone's, you know, I want to echo that. Election day is election day. And it just makes it simple.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, ma'am. All right. Yeah, not having any other, is there any other questions? Okay. Not having any other questions, I'm going to move to neutral comments first before the opponents. We have one conferee, and that is a representative from Secretary of State's office, Clay Barker.
Mr. Chair, you took me a little by surprise there. In the Senate this morning, we had the two sides go at each other, and then I came in at the end as neutral to give some technical points, but I'll stick to that. I think I know what the opponents will be saying.
It's kind of rough when you're neutral and you get chewed up by both sides, yeah.
I'm used to that, Mr. Chair. Fraud suppression. And I do appreciate, like Representative Lee said, the active citizens that are watching the process. They keep us all on our toes, make sure they see things and help the process run correctly. Getting onto the bill. Back in 2017, when the legislature learned that the mail delivery for ballots was taking longer and longer, it went from essentially 3 business days to at least 5. They made 2 changes to the code to try to address that at the same time. First, they moved earlier in the process the time when a voter could ask for an advance ballot from Friday before the election until Tuesday before the election. That would force people to ask for it earlier. And second, they added on the 3 extra days for delivery. And to be clear, that allowed a ballot that is postmarked, and it has to be postmarked, on or before Election Day to be received, processed, and counted if it arrived before the last mail delivery on Friday, which is usually Friday morning. As Representative Esau mentioned, I was in the middle of this cluster. In 2018, there were a lot of ballots, I wouldn't say a lot, but enough ballots that it caused concern for counties that arrived without a postmark, but within the 3-day period. And since that time, Brian Caskey, our elections director, has worked very closely with the Postal Service to make sure every ballot has a postmark. And he would be very concerned if early in the process a ballot arrived without a postmark. He would call the postal managers to make sure that that didn't happen again, knowing that when it came to the end of the election, that would be very important. Okay, some of the mechanical points, and I would refer you to Rick Pifo for maybe a little more detail since she's actually at the county level. First of all, these are just some technical points. The bill, as written, would be easy to apply. It's a clear, bright line rule. It would reduce some of the administrative burden on county clerks because they wouldn't have to be receiving and processing ballots in the 3 days after the election. They have a lot to do in that time, audits, getting ready for the county canvass. I know we keep hearing the phrase, election should be election day, but there are still ballots that will be counted after Election Day that aren't part of the county canvass. Write-in votes have to be processed after the election. Ballots that have to be hand-counted because the ballot's spoiled or somehow there's a mark on it that the machines can't pick up, and a special bipartisan board has to do those in Kansas. And sometimes, depending on the county, mail that arrived on Tuesday, so before 7 p.m., isn't given the security clearing, signature comparison, and process till Wednesday. That can happen. But the bill would end up with the unofficial results on election night being closer to the canvass's final. In 2020, there were about 32,000 pieces of mail that arrived Wednesday, Thursday, Friday that were counted. I was asked this morning. I do not know how many were rejected because they either didn't have a postmark or the postmark was too late. I did a quick phone call and found out in Johnson County in 2020 that had 336,000 total votes, only about 73 either had a postmark that was too late or came in Saturday and afterwards, and they combined those 2 groups. This could, and I have no evidence that it would or would not, create some confusion with voters because they go through one election where they have the 3 days, another election where they don't. on those 32,000 that came in Wednesday to Friday, of course, we have no idea how many people would have changed their delivery process for ballots if they knew this bill was in effect at the time. And we have no solution overall to the fact that the United States Postal Service is becoming, I don't want to besmirch them, but the delivery is slower and slower and more unreliable. Mail sent in Kansas does not get processed in Kansas. It goes to Texas, Colorado, or Michigan and has to come back. And even as recently as October 2021, the Postal Service announced that those ballots would take maybe up to 7 days. Just it's going to take that long to be delivered. And again, I don't have the overall solution to the slowness of the mail problem. Again, our office is neutral on this testimony, and we're just providing some mechanical details for you. And I would, again, reference you to the Real County Clerk, who can tell you what it's like processing it on the front lines.
Thank you, sir. Is there any questions for Mr. Barker? Representative Miller.
You made reference to county clerks struggling with the administrative difficulties.
Representative, I don't think struggling may be too hard a word.
Complaining, whining.
Some have mentioned it to me that if this bill were to pass, it would reduce some of the administrative burden on them.
I noticed none of them showed up as a proponent. We do have one representing the association that's listed as an opponent, and I look forward to his testimony, because no county clerk came here and said they supported this bill, right?
Correct, Representative.
Thank you.
This was just a factor, not a controlling factor.
Right, but if they had a big problem, they could have at least submitted written testimony.
Correct, they could.
Thank you.
And Representative Proctor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you have an idea of the order of magnitude of ballots that didn't get counted because they weren't postmarked, but they arrived within the deadline?
No, I do not. We don't, at our level, we do not track that. The counties might, and again, I tried just right before this meeting, I called Johnson County. They had 73, but they combined that as either the postmark was too late or it arrived too late.
Right, and so if the number Mr. Whitson gave in his testimony is correct, that 1,400 ballots didn't get counted because they showed up after the deadline, and some number didn't get counted because they weren't postmarked, we actually count less ballots, or we are excluding more ballots with the current law than we did back in 2016 when we only excluded 1,449.
If those numbers are correct, Representative, and I don't doubt the assertion, but I have to check on what exactly that 1,400 was. Sometimes the nomenclature that's used can make a difference in what we're comparing.
Right. But on principle, the fact that not only are we not counting ballots because they don't arrive in time, but we also have to consider the postmark, and we're excluding ballots that for some reason didn't get postmarked. We're excluding more ballots than we are if we're just doing the deadline.
We could be. I just have to look at the numbers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Clay. All right. Next up, we have a few opponents, and we'll try to follow the same rules of 3 minutes with the opponents. And the first one we have on list is Ann Ma, former state representative and former ranking member of the Elections Committee. Thank you, Ann, for being here.
Thank you. I was a former ranking member of this committee when Secretary Schwab was the chair, so enjoyed working with him. But today, I'm not here because of that. Today, I'm here because I'm a Kansan who has a passion for voting rights. I believe we are a better state and a better nation when everyone is given access to the franchise. So when I see bills like this that will deny tens of thousands of people the right to vote, I have to show up in person because that's just wrong. You know, there were very good reasons for passing Representative Miller's bill back in 2017, and everybody got it. I mean, in the Senate, this bill passed 40-0. In the House, it passed 123-1. And if you can figure out why Representative Carmichael votes the way he does, then you're a better person than I am. But it was 123-1 because everybody got it, that making sure everybody gets to vote is a bipartisan issue. I mean, the fact is, people just thought reasonably that if I get my ballot in the mail and it's postmarked on Election Day, it's going to get counted. That's just what they thought. They didn't know we were throwing out 1,400 ballots, and I think they would have been upset to know. But there was an easy fix that Representative Miller proposed, and everybody agreed. You know, we had to figure out how many days beyond Election Day would be reasonable. 3 was a reasonable number. But the fact is, at that time, the mail service was getting horrible, and it's even worse today. As was mentioned, Topeka mail was being sent to Kansas City. The city of Hayes, Salina, Dodge City, and Hutch all were being routed to Wichita. Mail from Liberal was going to Abilene, Texas. Mail from Colby was going to North Platte, Nebraska. It's no wonder you can even get mail there in 7 days these days. And look what's at stake. The Secretary of State's office said that if this bill had been in place in 2020, more than 32,000 votes would have been thrown out. 32,000 of your constituents disenfranchised. That should be a showstopper. I don't even know why we're talking about this bill when that many votes could be thrown out. Talk about destroying the faith in the election system. And these ballots are not late arriving. They are arriving absolutely on time according to the law. No outcomes were changed. The outcome is not known until Friday. That's when the ballots can be received. So rather than stoking unfounded fears about cheating, then let's talk the truth. We have safe and fair elections, and this bill is going to disenfranchise massive numbers of people. I sent you some numbers about Shawnee County, and I'd like you to take a look at that because we probably won't have time to go through it. But we had more than 8,690 ballots dropped off at mobile ballot boxes. If you would do something crazy like say all the ballot boxes have to be in the election office or you have to send them by mail, those numbers are just going to go up. So please consider 32,000 people deserve to have their votes counted and kill this bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Mott. Next, we have Michael Papa, Executive Director of Mainstream Coalition. Welcome to the committee, Michael.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. Mainstream Coalition opposes HB 2585. We found out this morning in the Senate committee on a similar bill, or on really identical bill. Thank you for that, by the way. Didn't have to prepare 2 pieces of testimony. That the reason for this bill, and we heard it again today, was because a minority of voters are confused or don't understand why vote totals would increase after Election Day. So instead of enacting legislation to disenfranchise voters, why don't you work with the Secretary of State's office to put forward an educational campaign around the voter protection period? We've heard repeatedly by the Secretary of State's office and himself that Kansas elections are secure. There's no evidence that accepting ballots in the voter protection period leads to fraud or has any security concerns. So we're asking, what does this bill do? Well, unfortunately, it disfranchises voters. And as you just heard, as I'm sure you've heard repeatedly, if this law was enacted in 2020, more than 32,000 legal votes would have been thrown out. 5 years ago, when the legislature enacted the voter protection period, you were saying to Kansans at that point, we realize that every vote matters, and we're going to do everything we can to protect that vote. HB 2585 breaks that promise to Kansans, and it codifies it. It records it in the state statute. From limiting ballot return delivery methods, taking away the 3-day voter protection period, banning widely used 24/7 ballot drop boxes, the rash of harmful election bills introduced this session is astounding. I ask you, please, just take a look at this from the outside. Put yourself in the voters' shoes who rely on these measures. I think you'll be hard-pressed to see that it's anything else than voter suppression tactics. We deserve the right to safely cast our ballots without unnecessary state government overreach. And this is a solution for a problem, looking for a problem. And it's a solution that would make it more difficult for eligible voters to cast their vote. We urge you to please oppose HB 2585. Thank you, and I'll stand for questions when it's appropriate.
Thank you, sir, and we'll call you if we need. Next, we have Mike Burgess, Director of Policy and Outreach for Disability Rights Center of Kansas. Thank you to committee. Yeah, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it isn't every day that we have so many former elections chairs in the room, so quite a treat to be part of that group. So as the chairman said, I'm Mike Burgess, the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. And you have my testimony in front of you, so I'll just kind of hit some of the highlights. As previously was covered, we know that the USPS, the delivery times are taking way longer, up to 7 days each way. In some cases, or potentially even longer if an individual happens to be out of state at the time where they're trying to do that. So there's a saying that some self-advocate friends, they say, you often heard the phrase, walk a mile in my shoes. Well, for some self-advocates, they say, wheel a mile in my chair is the phrase. And so again, for voting, for a lot of us, hopping in our car to return our ballot or filling it out, is a very simple process. But for some individuals with disabilities, that can be much more complicated and things that we often take for granted. I know, again, a self-advocate with dexterity challenges, he said, if you want to think about doing this, put a couple of oven mitts, really thick oven mitts on, and then try and do this. Fill out your ballot, slide it in the envelope, and then if you have assistance, make sure everything, all the affidavits are filled out correctly. Again, if you're not in a county with postage paid, make sure you get a stamp, affix it. And then for some folks, they require assistance just to get to leave their house. They may require special transportation. For individuals that are lucky enough to have paratransit, often that has to be arranged well in advance, sometimes days in advance, and kind of like the cable company, they may give you a window when they're going to show up, and hopefully they hit that window of time. And so they have additional barriers just in their daily life of trying to get ready for work, getting to work, from work, et cetera. And so in a nutshell, they face a lot of additional challenges. So as you're crafting policy, make sure you're taking these individuals into account. And while the permanent advance ballot is a wonderful tool, we encourage individuals with disabilities to take advantage of that tool. There's a lot of individuals, just like other voters, that like to show up on election day. Well, occasionally it happens that their transportation may follow through or change at the last minute. And having that 3-day grace period is a key piece to help ensure that they have a chance to get their vote counted. And one piece that we don't know, and speaking to the representative's question before, is there are people who may give up because right now they have the 3-day grace period, so they have a chance to have their ballot counted. Without that, they realize it's election day and they're running out of options and they just give up and don't. And so there are folks that would fall into that category too that wouldn't be in the statistics. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, again, I know it's a policy decision for the committee, but I just appreciate you taking into account all Kansans and especially Kansans with disabilities as you're making those decisions. And without a doubt, this provision would dramatically impact voters with disabilities, and because they do take advantage of advanced ballot or advanced voting by mail more often than the average citizen. So without a doubt, they would be impacted negatively by this. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Rick Pifo, Harvey County Clerk and Election Officer, and a long acronym of committee chair, and I've forgotten the whole name. So thank you for your attendance.
Thank you for letting me testify. I am Rick Pifo. I'm the Harvey County Clerk and Election Officer, and I'm also the chair of the Elections Committee for the Kansas County Clerks and Elections Officials Association. Hard to say all in one breath. KCCEOA for short. We have in our legislative platform to maintain status quo with regard to election registration and canvass schedules. We feel that this bill falls within that topic. We are opposing this bill. We've opposed similar bills like this in the past. One thing I do want to say is there was some comments made about results changing or flipping, or I would say that all results prior to the canvass are preliminary results. One way to fix that is you as a body could just say we don't report any results until canvass day, but that's just a comment. I have some statistics for what happened in Harvey County. I do want to point out that you may not be aware, but when you get a lot of mail, you start to see some of these trends. Tuesdays are basically a postal holiday. We get very little mail on Tuesdays. You can see from the 2020 election, we got 381 ballots on the Monday, 1 on Tuesday, and 455 on Wednesday. That's a huge swing. And that's early in the process when we were getting our most amount of ballots. We did get 45 on election day, but that was because the post office in Wichita, the plant manager actually went through the whole plant to find any envelopes that had the official election mail logo on them. And he made a point of going out and making sure that the offices that they were serving got those ballots before our office closed that day. So kudos to them for doing that. Otherwise, we'd had 45 more that wouldn't have come until the next day, or some number that wouldn't have come till the next day. In our county, the numbers were pretty low for receive after Election Day. We only had 27 total out of almost 7,000 or 6,900 ballots total returned. And you can see over there at the numbers, we had 27 that we counted, but there was basically were 6 that were not counted because they were late. The law says it has to be postmarked, but it also says it has to be verifiable. So even if it is postmarked and there's not a time on it that's clear, we're not allowed to count that ballot. I can give you an example. I know for a fact that the City of Sedgwick post office closes before 5 p.m. I had some ballots that the postmaster round stamped them at the counter, but a round stamp does not have a time on it. So I was not able to count those ballots, even though I know that they had to have been, they were postmarked on Election Day, and they had to have been received before 7 p.m. because they closed before 7, but I was not able to count those ballots. Now, with this bill, we would not only not be able to count the 27 that came Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we also possibly wouldn't be able to count others that were valid voted ballots. And I'm in favor of counting every ballot that's properly voted. So, I guess one other point, there was a point made about the burden on clerks. I would agree that there is some extra burden on clerks. We're starting to get used to it. I think some may appreciate not having that burden, but it's part of our job. So I would stand for questions when appropriate.
All right. Thank you, sir. We have 2 on WebEx for comment for opponent. And first one we'll recognize is Davis Hammett, President of Loud Light Civic Action.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for that. With a name like Davis, I'm pretty used to being called David and just going with it.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Say again?
Sorry, excuse me?
What did you say? I'm sorry. Were you already rolling? Okay.
I was just getting started. Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there are so many concerns about this bill. This bill is actually the most dangerous bill for democracy currently introduced in the Kansas legislature. The result would essentially be that Kansans would be punished for the failures of government. This isn't about what voters did, which is an important thing to remember. This isn't that voters hadn't did before or on election day. It's that the post service wasn't able to get their ballot to the county election office in time. Considering the fact that y'all are the government, a governing body, you would be the government punishing Kansas citizens for failures and shortcomings of the government. Whenever people talk about over 32,000 votes in the 2020 general election not being counted, that's 32,367. I know that with those big numbers, it can be easy to detach yourself from those, but those are individual citizens, your constituents with individual stories, reasons why their mail was maybe delayed a day or two in getting to you. They might be in military service in that's delayed. They might be at college. They might be an experience that I had this past election in 2021, where I found myself having to leave the state for several months to take care of my mom who had stage 4 cancer. And so I had to vote. And then it was like just a couple days before the election, I was like, oh yeah, I do have to turn that in. And this is me, someone who does, but people are caught up with their lives and circumstances. And so having those 3-day grace period allows those votes to have the proper time to get in and get counted. When this was passed in 2017, it also happened where they were making it so you had to request a mail ballot earlier. Instead of the Friday before elections, it was a week before election. This was all an additional timeline designed so that people who had cast their ballot on or before election day could know that their vote was being counted. This passed with bipartisan unanimous support, except for Representative Carmichael, as was stated. And also last year, the Kansas Legislature in House Bill
Mr. Hammond,
2083.
about 30 seconds.
Okay, last year to address this exact same concern, well, it's already a federal crime to tamper with mail ballots. Y'all made it a state crime to alter that postmark. So you've already addressed this concern. And I just want to close by saying conspiracy-minded individuals who were unsatisfied by all the bills y'all passed last year will be similarly unsatisfied with this bill. But if you keep on acting on unsubstantiated claims of fraud, you are going to, in past harmful restrictions, more and more Kansans are going to doubt the outcome, and they are going to have evidence to doubt the outcome when they see tens of thousands of ballots are being thrown out for no reason. I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. We have written only, we have one more. Sheila, is that your first name? Sheila King.
It's Seal, short for Lucille.
Okay, I made it more complex than it needed to be. Advocacy Chair for the League of Women Voters of Kansas, and if you have 3 minutes, if you could share your thoughts on the opponent.
Right. Yes, I was going back to the 2017 hearings that you all had to get this 3-day window of opportunity to voters, and found that, in fact, I was at those hearings, but in addition to Vic Miller sponsoring this bill, Brian Caskey, with the Director of Elections for the Kansas Secretary of State's office, was testifying as a proponent to extending the deadline to receive these mail ballots returned up to the 3rd day after the election. And he stated the United States Postal Service has decreased the number of locations that process mail in the state of Kansas, and as a result, an increase in the amount of time needed to transmit mail has occurred in the few years since. Jamie Hsu, who is Douglas County clerk, he also testified for this bill, and similarly to Brian Caskey, was stating that it was the U.S. Postal Service trying to alert citizens and voters to the fact that their ballots may take 7 days to get there. And because we only send these ballots out 20 days in advance, it could be down to the wire for returning them back to the election office. I wanted to remind everybody that it's not only Kansans who are living in Kansas that is affected by this bill. It's also students who are out of state, military perhaps who are working out of state, and any other person who might be working out of state. It could be our doctors or nurses who are serving in Ohio hospitals because of COVID. It could be firefighters somewhere. And so it's the multiple factions. We've heard about the disabled, the disability concerns. We've heard about just the lack of mail service in some areas. And so it's multiple reasons that a person might need to have these 3 extra days to make sure that the mail has time to deliver their ballot back to the election office. We ask you to vote no on this bill. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, Seal. And next we have on Webex, lastly, we have Aileen Berquist. Don't say that name very often about another person. Community Engagement Manager for the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Chair Berquist. As far as I know, no relation. The ACLU of Kansas opposes this bill because we believe the current 3-day grace period is necessary to allow voters, the USPS, and election clerks much needed flexibility to ensure that all votes are appropriately counted. And we all know that flexibility was very much needed during the pandemic. We had incredible turnout in the 2020 election. Pew Research estimated that nearly 2/3 of eligible voters cast their ballots. Almost 500,000 Kansans voted through advance ballot by mail. And as has been stated, 32,367 of those ballots arrived during that 3-day grace period because mail does not always arrive on time. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, this was the case. And this reality does not point to a conspiracy or evidence that the Postal Service is not secure. It is simply a reality of the complex system that gets our mail where it needs to go. At any time, another natural or man-made disaster could limit the ability of this system to work efficiently. And we truly need this flexibility to ensure that all validly cast ballots are counted. So we ask that you not pass this bill and that you instead focus on some legislation that would expand access to voting for Kansans, and do that by listening to and empowering our local elections clerks, who I'm sure are struggling just as much as all of us during the pandemic and could use your support. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Aileen. And now we will consider questions from committee to any of the conferees that were opponents. And I will recognize Representative Lee and then Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Mr. Pipo? Thank you for your testimony. Couple of questions for you. How do we handle armed forces ballots? How does that, or military ballots, how does that process work?
Most of those would be handled through UOCAVA, which is they fill out an FPCA form. It's a federal postcard application, and they can receive their ballots by mail, email, fax. So the federal service voters are handled completely separate, I think, from
I just didn't know.
but they still have to be returned by election day. Like if they're going to email it, it has to be emailed and received before 7 p.m.
Okay. And then how long do folks have right now to do the advance mail ballots? That's 3 weeks? Is that what I'm hearing?
We mail them 20 days before the election. They can request.
Not all of them.
We start mailing them, we start mailing them the 20th day before the election. So all the applications that we've received prior to that, we do the first slug on that 20 days before. If applications are received from that day up until the 7th day before the election, we mail them out as soon as we can after we receive the application. That's why that date was moved up to a week before the election, because prior, it was on the Friday. Well, they could request it on Friday, but if we mailed it, they probably weren't even going to get it before Election Day. So that's part of why that date was changed.
So do you think, as a follow-up, Mr. Chair, do you think then it would be, has it ever been discussed in your group to mail ballots maybe a month prior to, so that we could have one election day if we allowed some time more time at the beginning?
We haven't really discussed it. Right now, it's aligned with the voter registration deadline. Voter registration deadline is 21 days before the election. So you would have some overlap in there that you're mailing ballots and people could still be registering. And that was part of some changes that were made a few years back to try and get those aligned, so we didn't have registering after they were already getting ballots potentially.
Great, thanks so much.
Representative Proctor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Vivo. I want to ask you a question, then I've got a question for Mr. Hammett. So first of all, thank you for your service to your community. I know you've got a tough job, especially in several intense weeks a year. So if Mr. Whitson's testimony was correct that, and the data we got from the Secretary of State's office is correct from last year, about the same number of ballots were excluded because they showed up late before and after the election. So those additional ballots that you're now excluding because you can't read the postmark or the postmark's incorrect, would it be reasonable to conclude that we are excluding more votes now than we were before we changed this law because we've added the additional requirement of postmark?
I don't think so, because right now, before, it didn't matter when they were postmarked. If we didn't get it before 7 p.m., they didn't count. Now, we're only excluding the ones that we can't verify that their postmark was before 7 p.m. So in my case, I excluded 6 because they didn't meet the requirements, but I would have had to exclude another 27.
But I mean, that's assuming that people didn't change their behavior because we changed the law. And that's my big challenge with a lot of the testimony, but I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, if I could, I'd like to ask Mr. Hammond a question as well.
Proceed.
Thank you. So Mr. Hammond, I'll pose a similar question to you that I did about the data that we have from the proponent testimony and from the information we got from the Secretary of State's office last year, is that about the same number of ballots showed up late after the deadline, before and after this 3-day grace period was passed. But I'm picking on you, but several other conferees also said that 32,000 people would be disenfranchised if we changed the deadline. So is your testimony that Kansans are not smart enough to figure out if we change the law that they have to mail their ballot 3 days earlier?
So there's a lot of assumptions. First off, thank you for the question, Mr. Representative. So first off, on that 1,400 number that the Opportunity Solutions Project representative had said, I'm not sure what he was discussing. He might have been referring to testimony earlier in Senate, Fed, and State when they were talking about how there were 1,400 ballots just in Johnson County, just in this 2021 local election that came in during the 3-day grace period. I would also say that the 32,367 number is from the 2020 general election. It's important to compare apples to apples, exactly what elect we're talking about, because, obviously primaries, generals, different elections, those numbers vary. And one other thing to keep in mind is that there's an assumption that the data collection is great, and it's not, right? This is actually something I've worked on for years around provisional ballots, and I've sued the state. I'm in ongoing litigation with the Secretary of State about this. It's not like counties before this even went into place were always properly documenting these ballots that come in. The ballot doesn't, if it's 2016 and a ballot comes in a week after the election, it doesn't matter. Many counties might not even document those documents. So we don't really have good data to compare it with. Really, some of the only reliable data we have is in that 2020 election, which is the 32,367 Kansans. Now, as far as people stupid, I actually don't think that Kansans are stupid. I think that it's actually kind of reverse. I think it's this assumption that Kansans are unable to comprehend that elections are a process instead of something that magically ends at 7 p.m. and is already calculated. If you sit there and explain the provisional process, the canvass process, the mail ballot process, people will get it. You just have to explain it to them. It's just something you're not used to hearing. And we've actually, I've laid out graphics and stuff to explain to people how this process works and why it takes time and how election contests work and recounts and all of that stuff. But the issue too is, again, you're making an assumption about the individual's intelligence or their motives or whatever. This doesn't have to do with that. This is about a changing USPS. As was stated, the United States Postal Service has been slowing down. There are more issues. You know, a decade ago, every piece of mail sent in Kansas didn't have to leave the state and sometimes go multiple states over to be processed. Those processing facilities were closed recently. So it's really that the environment is changing around Kansans. And now for several years, they have built a voting habit. And if you were to change the system without them being informed, because again, these, you know, y'all are lawmakers. I'm someone who like cares about, you know, these issues deeply. If you're a normal person, you're every day checking up to see how election law changed. In fact, there were so many election laws changed last year that I'm still struggling to answer people's questions about the change I had made last year. So again, this is about the system changing around people. And our only goal here is to make sure that citizens who cast their vote, that their vote is counted. And this bill does the opposite. This disenfranchises Kansans through no fault of their own.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State's office if they could provide us with apples to apples, as Mr. Hammett said. I'd like to know how many ballots were excluded in 2020. I've got a preliminary number here before they had done all the data of 400 as opposed to 1400.
If we could ask for them to send that to the committee between now and future consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir. And I will now recognize Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to call the committee's attention. You should have received testimony from when the bill was heard, the year it was enacted. I want to say on behalf of the Postal Service and the people who work the post office, they're more like the gentleman that was described by the county clerk that went out of his way to ensure the timeliness of these ballots. The problem was not created by the workers there. The problem was that the post office, as a matter of policy, started closing their processing centers, and that's what caused the delay. That's why in Topeka, you'd be shorted getting your ballot in versus somebody in Kansas City, because we no longer have a processing center. And as you'll note here on some of these locations, that's why the people out in the rural parts of Kansas would be shorted in terms of their ability to cast a ballot versus somebody from the Kansas City area who can count on overnight delivery. We can no longer count on overnight delivery in Topeka simply because they closed our processing center. And again, that's even more aggravated for some of the more remote places. This bill was to even out the playing field so that all citizens had somewhat of a even chance of seeing that their ballot was returned on time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Miller. If not seeing any other questions from committee or the conferees. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Representative Howell.
Sorry. Just real quickly, I had a question for Rick, if he wouldn't mind. And if you're not the best person, just let me know. My question is, you referenced the fact that when you had the round postmark that does not have the time stamp on it, that you made the decision as the chief election clerk in your county to not count those ballots because you couldn't legally prove that they were in before 7 p.m. Right. Are you confident, or do you know, do all county clerks and the 2 election commissioners in Sedgwick County follow that exact same decision-making process? Or does each county perhaps make a decision to err on the other side to say, as long as the date says the correct date, we'll assume that it was postmarked by 7 p.m.?
I would hope that they're all following it. That's what the law says, is that it's clearly identified as being mailed before 7 p.m. on Election Day.
Okay. So the law does specify that specifically. All right. Thank you.
And Representative Smith.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Barker, could I ask you a question? This may have been said today already, but the drop boxes, are they locked at 7 o'clock, or
Yes, Representative, on election night, they should be locked precisely at 7 PM. Most counties have well, they're required to have a bipartisan board, at least one Republican, one Democrat show up. Many also have a sheriff's deputy go with them, but they're locked at 7, and they should be emptied of all the ballots. I can't say that every county does that precisely. Some may wait till the next morning, but I think they should be emptied that night.
Thank you. I heard on TV one time, it said Jimmy Carter, President Carter, made the comment, the easiest way to have election fraud is to mail in ballot. And I'm not even a mail-in ballot person, but the 3 days, even though I don't like it, I can live with it. So thank you, Mr. Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. I will close this hearing on HB 2585 and thank all the conferees and all the audience for your attendance and those online for the extra time. We will consider final action on bills previously heard on Thursday, and we will also have a hearing and a possible action on HB 2653. And that is on Thursday, so prepare for comments and a little protracted time, but we want to finish up before turnaround. And we thank you for your attention. Is there any other comments for the good of the body from the committee? If we're okay, we will close this meeting and see you on Thursday.